Thank you very much, Charles. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate your clarification regarding presentation format. That saves me one clarifying comment. But I do have one other caveat to offer before I begin talking about Lopez Obrador, AMLO, and Mexico's fourth transformation. And that's that I have a very imperfect record of prediction regarding Mexican politics. In 2012 and 13, when the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, was returned to power after 12 years' absence, my great fear was that the PRI would try to reestablish the hegemony that it had exercised for nearly 71 years in Mexico, and that in 2018 it would refuse to leave power or find some way to maintain itself in power. And of course, to show you just how badly wrong my concerns were, in July this past year, Mexican voters basically viewed the PRI as purely radioactive, rejected it on a massive scale, and the party that has been such a central force in Mexican politics for 90 years is now fragmented and does face some prospect of breaking up and disappearing. So I trust that you'll take all of my comments with at least one grain of salt. Before turning to specific public policy challenges, which is what Charles has asked me to speak about, I do want to offer you a brief overview of the transformation that's occurred in Mexico's political landscape. People now refer to the AMLO tsunami that arrived in July of this year. Lopez Obrador had led the public opinion polls throughout the presidential campaign, but no one anticipated that he would win a victory as large as he did. In a four-candidate race, he won a clear majority of 53.2% of the vote, carrying 31 of Mexico's 32 states. And his margin of victory over the second-place National Action Party, or PAN candidate, Ricardo Anaya, was 22 percentage points, which shows you just how massive the rejection of the existing system was and support for Lopez Obrador, or AMLO, was. What Mexico really experienced is what people now refer to as the politics of hartazo, being absolutely fed up with impunity, corruption, extreme violence and public insecurity, persistent inequality and poverty, slow growth, etc. President Enrique Peña Nieto, the incumbent, in July had a public disapproval rate of 71%, which is unprecedented in Mexican history. The only close parallel I can think of in Latin America was in Argentina after the 2001 financial crisis, when there was a broad public movement, popular political movement to throw them all out. And that's basically what happened in Mexico this past July. AMLO's party, Morena, the Movement for National Renovation, and its allies now have a majority in both houses of Congress and a supermajority in the Federal Chamber of Deputies. That's the first time that any party in Mexico has held that edge since 1994. And at least for now, Lopez Obrador has an extraordinarily broad basis of popular support. So much so that as president-elect, he has been undertaking substantive initiatives that raise real procedural, quasi-constitutional questions about just what the mandate or responsibility of a president-elect should be. And Enrique Peña Nieto, as some of you may have noticed, has virtually disappeared from public view. The flip side of all of this is that the fragmentation and marginalization of not only the PRI, but of other Mexican political parties as well. The National Action Party is now deeply split. I think in time it will refind its feet. It's a party with a long democratic tradition and internal democratic tradition and strong core support. But for now, the PAN is very much on the ropes. And the center-left Party of the Democratic Revolution, or PRD, is virtually decimated as a political force. Over the last year, many of its founders and supporters migrated to Morena and Lopez Obrador, And now the impulse to be on the winning side, I think, will become a tidal force in terms of PRD supporters, and it could well disappear. These are not the only parties to have suffered in July. The Social Encounter Party, the New Alliance Party, and the Citizen Movement Party all lost their registrations. For those who back AMLO and Morena, this is really a unique opportunity to bring about broad change in Mexico. What AMLO calls Mexico's fourth transformation, in reference to the early 19th century independence movement, the mid-19th century liberal reform movement leading to a new constitution in 1857, and the social revolution of 1910 to 1920. But the fact that Morena is still largely a one-person show, the fact that AMLO and Morena now have extensive executive and legislative authority, the fact that Mexico has a long tradition of hierarchy in government, and the fact that opposition parties and potential countervailing forces are now greatly weakened, all do raise, I think, serious questions about the character of democratic governance in Mexico in the years ahead. Only time will tell. I do, however, want to offer one example that I find troubling in this regard, and that is AMLO's proposal for state-level integral development program delegates. These would be per state, a single presidentially appointed delegate, executive official, who would supervise all federal programs in a particular state. And it's important to note that most states rely upon federal fiscal transfers for 80 to 100% of their budgets. That seems to me a recipe for corruption, administrative breakdown, and potentially constitutional crisis. So on that optimistic note, let me now turn to four more specific challenges that the López Obrador administration is likely to face. Let me start with the NAFTA negotiations, NAFTA 2.0, as I would refer to it. The negotiations over a revised North American Free Trade Agreement have suffered many ups and downs since August 2017 when they began. The odds are now that there will be a trilateral agreement among Canada, Mexico, and the United States signed sometime this autumn, for the simple reason that all three countries in the end find it in their interest to do so, and that all three governments now want a quick resolution of the matter. On the Mexican side, the Peña Nieto government wants to claim one final accomplishment, and it is, quite frankly, a very short list that they would be adding to. They're counting on the revised state investor settlement dispute settlement procedures in the new NAFTA to protect their energy sector reforms. Mexico has made major concessions to the United States, to the Trump administration, to try to salvage a deal. They have, for example, agreed against substantial domestic private sector opposition to the idea of wage minimum provisions in the new automotive rules of domestic content, which is unprecedented in a free trade agreement. And so Mexico, at least the Peña Nieto administration, desperately wants this to go forward. AMLO, too, wants an agreement to be signed before December 1st so that he can concentrate on his domestic priorities. But even if that happens, I think it is quite possible that he will eventually come under domestic pressures as the terms of the agreement become public, and maybe pressures to revise parts of them because they will be perceived as U.S. impositions on Mexico. That would presumably have to occur under a somewhat less unilateral U.S. president than Donald Trump. But my point is, but certainly in the short term, a signature of a final or a revised NAFTA 2.0 would eliminate one of the drags on growth and investment that's affected Mexico and, for that matter, Canada as well. If all of this does become a problem, if it goes pear-shaped in the local terminology, for example, if Canada and the United States are unable to reach agreement on a number of the contentious issues they're now negotiating over, and if the U.S. Congress were to reject a bilateral Mexico-U.S. agreement on legal or political grounds, and the signals out of the Congress have been very strong in that regard, then AMLO would face an early unanticipated challenge. And some parts of his extremely heterogeneous coalition might well refuse to go along with some of the terms already agreed to by the Peña Nieto team. And that is actually one theme I will come back to in several different contexts. AMLO's coalition is extremely heterogeneous. The fighting within it over what policy positions that the new government will take are not yet settled. And I think in a number of areas it makes it very difficult to predict exactly what public policy will turn out to be. A second challenge, and perhaps the most obvious and pressing one, has to do with public insecurity, drug trafficking violence, and corruption. Generalized public insecurity and massive drug-related violence are no doubt Mexico's greatest problem and the greatest legacy that Peña Nieto has left for López Obrador. Through February 2018, there had been, during the Peña Nieto administration, 102,000 homicides. If you add that to the 102,000 homicides that occurred over the entire 6-year term of President Felipe Calderón, you have a total number of deaths related in one form or another to drug-related violence that is equal to that of decades-long civil conflicts in Guatemala and Colombia. On a proportional population basis, that would be the equivalent of 100,000 homicides in the UK over an 11-year period, if you can possibly imagine that in this country. So long as there is a U.S. demand for drugs, and of course that's the principal driver, but there's also a growing public urban demand for drugs in Mexico, drug trafficking will be very much part of the Mexican economy and society. And indeed, some analysts have argued that as many as 800,000 people are employed in the drugs industry in one form or another. As many as 120,000 people, maybe in the state of Guerrero, may be employed in the production of opium poppies alone. Right? So we're talking about a phenomenon that not only affects the country as a whole in terms of violence and insecurity, but is deeply embedded in Mexican economy and society. It's also worth noting that this is an international security problem. It's driven in large part, or in good part, by money and firearms flowing south from the United States, and the fact that Mexican cartels have now established themselves in Central America and South America as well. AMLO's statement that he would, during the campaign, that he would offer an amnesty as one approach to the drug trafficking problem drew a lot of scrutiny and condemnation. And I think it's still very unclear exactly what he meant by that and how he might proceed in those regards. He now defends the proposition mainly in terms of his openness to considering all possible new solutions in a situation where no one has really come up with a recipe for success in the past. In his more recent statements, he's accepted that at least in the short term, the Mexican armed forces will have to remain involved as a way of combating drug trafficking-related violence. That, to me, sheds new light or additional light on something that is really truly remarkable. And that is that after nearly 2 decades of efforts to reform the Mexican judiciary and Mexican law enforcement, these systems remain characterized by inefficiency, corruption, and impunity. Those reform efforts have been undertaken with a great deal of financial and technical support from the United States, and yet they found very, very little traction. With regard to corruption, during the campaign, López Obrador said that basically his own example of personal integrity would be enough to eliminate the problem, and that by eliminating corruption, that would basically almost by magic eliminate every other problem that Mexico faces, including a historically low rate of economic growth. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that. If, in fact, there is strong support from the top down, it may well be that Mexico's fledgling anti-corruption institutions and the Mexican judiciary, with strong support from civil society, will begin to make some inroads into the problems. But that will be very difficult under the best of circumstances. And the recent comments that he made regarding Rosario Robles, the outgoing Secretary of Rural and Urban Development, who has a questionable record of public integrity going back at least 20 years, has already sent some wrong signals in that regard, I think. One key area to watch here, I think, will be López Obrador's evolving relationship with the Mexican armed forces. They have, of course, pledged their constitutional loyalty both to López Obrador and to the new government. But one of the consequences of the war on drugs since 2006 and before is that the armed forces have accumulated a tremendous amount of power and autonomy. One explanation for the fact that the Peña Nieto administration never got to the bottom of the Ayotzinapa crisis, the disappearance and presumed death of 43 teacher training candidates in Iguala, Guerrero in 2014, is that the Mexican military was at least indirectly involved, and that any effort to really get to the bottom of the matter would reveal military involvement in heroin trafficking. López Obrador has made a great public promise and appointed key people to lead a serious investigation into the Ayotzinapa matter. And it is possible that if they pursue this matter in depth, that there will be a problem, there will be a crisis in terms of López Obrador's relationship with the military high command. The military's insistence on a public security law, or an internal security law, I should say, to give them some protection against human rights charges that they encounter as they undertake anti-drug trafficking operations, may also put Mexico's, López Obrador's human rights supporters in conflict with the military as well. And so that relationship is one that will be sorted out, I think, with some complications in the years ahead. Third, an also obvious topic has to do with energy policy. There's been a tremendous amount of international attention to and speculation about AMLO's likely energy policy. He was, of course, a vociferous critic of the 2013 constitutional reform that permitted foreign investment in the petroleum industry, and he still condemns that reform, at least rhetorically. He has, of course, as all of you know, promised to review the exploration and production contracts granted to foreign companies. Now, in his defense in this regard, one has to say that the letting of public contracts, including in the oil and gas industry, has been a major source of corruption in Mexico for a long, long time. The Peña Nieto administration took pride in the publicly transparent contract approval procedures that it developed as part of its reform process. But I think it would be somewhat naive to expect that all of that worked according to plan. Given the heterogeneity of AMLO's coalition and the widely varying comments made by key members of his transition team at different points, I think it's very difficult to predict exactly what what specific energy policies López Obrador might adopt. But I would argue that they are likely to be the product of three interacting factors. First would be Mexico's objective energy needs. Without foreign investment, it's virtually impossible to conceive of Mexico reversing the sharp decline in production that has occurred over the last several years. The federal government is highly dependent upon tax revenues from the energy sector. And so finding ways to push energy production forward will be a crucial issue for the new government. The dependence of the federal government's dependence on Pemex, the national oil company's taxes, has been criticized by the incoming director of the company, but he is a long-term member of the Pemex board and is presumably a realist in these matters. And so whether radical change will occur in that regard is, I think, open to question. A second factor would be the NAFTA 2.0 investor-state dispute settlement procedures, which would certainly raise the legal and reputational costs that the government would pay of any radical change with regard to the contracts already let to foreign companies. But the third factor would be AMLO's very strong commitment to improving, reforming, and strengthening Pemex and its role in the development of Mexico's southeast. López Obrador is, of course, from the state of Tabasco, where his original political base was, and he has a number of plans to try to promote development in what is Mexico's most impoverished region. And so, on balance, I think López Obrador will very much lean in Pemex's favor and not necessarily in favor of foreign companies as they negotiate for future business. And finally, let me turn to a fourth and somewhat different kind of challenge, and that is wage and labor reform. And all of the previous issues that I've talked about are, in some sense, very obvious ones. They've been the source of much public and media attention. This fourth policy challenge is somewhat more surprising in that regard. Several years ago, I attended an investment promotion meeting on Mexico held over here in Canary Wharf, in which a Mexican official, in trying to find ways to promote people's interest in investing in his country, bragged that wages in Mexico had not gone up for 8 years. Now, I wondered at the time if would ever hear again a foreign official brag about the inability of his people's inability to get ahead as a basis for promoting investment in his country. But the fact is that successive Mexican governments, under both the PRI and the PAN, have for about 30 years engaged in systematic wage suppression policies. There have been some real wage increases in some parts of the manufacturing industry, but for the most part, in taking real minimum wages as the baseline, and they're important because they remain the baseline for many private sector negotiations over wage increases, there's not been any real wage increase in over 20 years. AMLO has, of course, proposed to raise minimum wages progressively over a 6-year period. And he's had widespread support for that proposal, including from people in the private sector. Whether the national private sector remains committed to that or open to that as wages actually begin to rise is, of course, another question. AMLO also apparently supported the Peña Nieto concession to the U.S. on the idea of a $16 US minimum wage in parts of the automotive industry, and he did so against great domestic opposition. That opposition, I think, will come bubbling up under López Obrador, and we'll see how that policy actually plays out in the automotive industry in years ahead. But apart from wages, the López Obrador administration is publicly committed to implementing widespread reforms concerning freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining. Given that Morena controls a majority in the Mexican Senate, I think it's now quite likely that the Senate will finally approve the International Labor Organization's Convention number 98 on the right to collective bargaining. And AMLO's transition team is now at work on the secondary legislation that would give form to the 2017 constitutional reforms regarding freedom of association and the transfer of a much discredited trilateral conciliation and arbitration board system from the executive branch to the judiciary. All of this is designed in good part to try to end the practice of so-called employer protection contracts. These are contracts that are agreed between the leaders, corrupt or spurious leaders of employer-dominated unions and the employer that in principle reflect or observe minimum federal labor law requirements, but in practice give the employer virtually complete control over relations in the workplace. Once these agreements come into force, they have the force of law behind them. And since the 1980s, they've become really ubiquitous in a number of economic activities, including auto parts, banking, commercial aviation, and particularly in the so-called maquiladora, or in-bond processing sector. Under the new rules that will come into effect, assuming that this legislation is approved by the Senate, a minimum of 30% of workers in a given workplace would have to agree a contract before it is formally signed, and all future union elections would be held by secret ballot. That's a huge change, because up until now, one of the mechanisms that incumbent union leaders have used to maintain their position is to have elections in an open assembly, in which dissidents can be identified and later fired. If fully implemented, these changes would really constitute a revolution in state labor relations in Mexico. And I think it's because of that, it's highly likely that there will be strong pushback from business and from the old line labor movement allied with the PRI. But it will certainly be a test of López Obrador's conviction in promoting widespread reform in Mexico. And it would mean that state labor relations or employer-worker relations come to the centerpiece or the center of Mexican politics the first time in many decades. And so, to sum up very briefly, Mexico is a country with immense, deeply rooted problems. AMLO has a historically unique opportunity to propose and implement new solutions to these problems. Whether Mexico, at the end of his 6-year term in 2024, is really a different country or on a better path is an open question.